Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is the first of a two-part City Talk on crime and criminal justice. Over the last 25 years, there's been a dramatic rise and then fall in violent crime in New York City and the nation. Today, we experience the lowest level of violence in a generation. That's the good news. The bad news is that daunting problems remain. Many of them, the unintended consequence of our criminal justice and policing efforts. To talk about crime, policing, and criminal justice is Jeremy Travis, the president of CUNY's John Jay College of Criminal Justice since 2004. From 2000 to 2004, he was a senior fellow at the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And for 6 years before that, he directed the National Institute of Justice, the research arm of the U.S. Department of Justice. Prior to his service in Washington, President Travis was a deputy commissioner in the NYPD. He has written extensively on crime and criminal justice. His most recent book is But They All Come Back, Facing the Challenges of Prisoner Reentry. President Travis, it's been a long time, 5 years.
It has been. It's good to be here.
Congratulations. I went to the John Jay website, and you're ranked number 10 by U.S. News & World Report. Congratulations.
We love being in the top 10.
Absolutely. Also, you've got a lot else going on. You've got new building, new curriculum. You're doing a lot of stuff. Talk to us about Jay in 2009, John Jay in 2009.
Well, John Jay is a college that's in the midst of a really exciting transformation. We are changing our student profile. We're phasing out associate degree admissions and creating partnerships with all 6 community colleges of the CUNY system so that they can offer associate degree programs in criminal justice and forensic science. And those students, once they complete there, can come to John Jay for the baccalaureate program. We're expanding access to these exciting disciplines. And in 2 more years, we'll be a fully recognized senior college, baccalaureate, master's, and doctoral program. So we're really raising the profile, raising
no
the standards.
longer top school, if you will.
Right, and we've adopted as our motto, educating for justice, by which we mean that we bring people to our college who are broadly interested in the justice questions, whether it's through the forensic science lens or human rights lens or policing and safety and security lens, or even looking at justice issues through literature or history. So that's a big change. We're also, with support of the university, adding many more faculties. We've increased the number of full-time faculty by 25% over 4 years, just unheard of.
Yep.
Now fully a third of our faculty have been hired since I came on as president.
Wow.
And so it's bringing energy and new ideas and a different sort of global vision of the curriculum and of our justice themes into the college. It's a very exciting time.
Okay.
And as you mentioned, we have a new building going up on 11th Avenue. It'll be done in 2 years. A really stunning, magnificent tower looking out over the Hudson with a campus between our current building and our new building so our students can sit outside and talk about whatever they want to talk about under the trees. So it's a phenomenal time, and finally we're adding new majors. So unlike the Cop College of old, we're adding majors in English and economics and history and gender studies and philosophy so that our students have options. And each of these majors is distinctive because it's at John Jay. So we ask our faculty to think about the connection between English and our Educating for Justice theme. So we have a whole track in our English major on law and literature. So we're offering courses on things like murder and Shakespeare. Right, so we're just using the interdisciplinary and intellectual energy of the faculty.
I taught a course once on murder. This is good. I like this.
But did you add Shakespeare?
Well, of course.
Imagine if you had.
Well, excuse me. No, this is, but this is excellent because this, knowing our students, CUNY students in general, this is the way to. It makes it real. It makes it engaging. It makes it meaningful in a way.
So it's a very exciting time to be at
excellent.
MJ.
You talk about energy and new ideas. We've got a new president, new administration. What do you see? What do you feel? You've been down in D.C. What's going? What are your hopes and what are your expectations?
Well, first, just to report on what it feels like to be in Washington. I spent, as you noted, 10 years there, 6 in the Clinton administration and 4 in the first Bush administration outside of government. And Washington's an exciting place these days. There's a sense of possibility, there's a sense of optimism and hope. In our field, in the criminal justice field, we have just this wonderful constellation of members of the cabinet. Eric Holder is a good friend of mine who was U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and then Deputy Attorney General under Janet Reno, is now the Attorney General. What a strong statement that is. Somebody who's so highly regarded and well thought of in our field is running the Justice Department. The new drug czar, the director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, Gil Kurlikowski, another good friend of mine and of the college, former police chief in Seattle, just the other day declared that he's not going to use the metaphor, the war on drugs.
What did that mean? I never got it.
What a wonderful break with a sort of a nonsensical metaphor. You know, on whom have we declared war? That we have a war on
our own
drugs.
Populations?
And it lends to, contributes to the demonization of people who break the law and the sense that they're some other than us. And this us and them dichotomy is really very damaging to the country. So his first interview in the Wall Street Journal, of all places, he says he's no longer going to use that metaphor because it's misunderstood and it implies there's an enemy, and who could those enemies be other than fellow Americans? So that's refreshing. Certainly we know what Attorney General Holder has done in terms of torture issues and what the President has done in terms of Guantanamo, but closer to home in terms of our core issues, criminal justice issues, what we see is, first of all, a strong emphasis on research. One of the first things we noted in the first Obama budget was an increase in funding for the Bureau of Justice Statistics to be able to measure crime accurately.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things
that had been cut out by the prior administration.
What you pointed out is the real serious lack of empirical data on which these policies are first, conceived and then designed and then implemented.
Right. So if you believe, as I do, that policies, all policies, but particularly in this area, should be data-driven and evidence-based, you need the data and you need the evidence. So you need to support research. So President Obama went to the National Academy of Sciences a month ago and delivered a remarkable speech on the importance of science and how evidence will guide the policy discussions in his administration. We're seeing that in the justice arena already. It's very exciting.
Looking back at the previous administration, you just talked about energy and new ideas. There were policies developed during the Bush administration that are praiseworthy, that in fact you in your testimony and your writing have seen as steps forward. Talk about that, and we'll get back to it later, but the notions of reentry and how you deal with prisoners, etc.
Well, there are 2 areas in particular where I give the Bush administration credit in terms of its crime policies. One was it initiated a program called Project Safe Neighborhoods, known by, as all things are known by the acronym PSN. So PSN continued an idea that we had started in the Clinton administration, that local communities partnering with universities should develop data-based, data-driven crime strategies. It wasn't uniformly high quality, but there were some pockets of excellence throughout the country where these ideas really flourished and took hold. So they kept alive something that's very important that we are now building on at John Jay with this new initiative we'll talk about called the National Network for Safe Communities, and the new administration is going to build on. So that's one. The second one is the Bush administration took what was an embryonic idea that Janet Reno and I developed at the end of the Clinton administration, this focus on prisoner reentry. And they could have let it just die on the vine. Instead, they not only kept it alive, but they put a lot of money into it. They created this coalition of cabinet agencies ranging from the Justice Department to Labor Department to the Veterans Administration to National Institute of Mental Health to combine funds to support reentry initiatives around the country. And President Bush himself, and I always like to credit him for this, in his 2004 State of the Union address, when he was listing his domestic policy initiatives, the last one he listed, he announced a presidential initiative on prisoner reentry and used what to this day are some of the most eloquent words ever spoken by a public official, where he described America as the land of the second chance. And I paraphrase here, but he basically said, when the prison gates close, we as a nation believe, that the individual leaving prison should have an opportunity for a better life. That call from the president led to an initiative in the Congress spearheaded by Rob Portman, who was then in a leadership position when the Republicans were in control, called the Second Chance Act, borrowing that language from President Bush's State of the Union address. And that act, which was passed, and then I was honored to be in Washington when it was signed by the president, that act has broad bipartisan support from all ends of the political spectrum, and is now the framework that the Obama administration is now using to promote federal leadership and more money. They're putting in more money to support the challenges of people leaving prison. Before
we got on camera, you were talking about, surprisingly, one of the reasons why the Bush administration was so proactive in this regard. Could you talk about that?
Well, the politics of the reentry movement are absolutely fascinating. If you go back 20 years ago, crime policy was always an overheated public debate. Ideologically defined, there were polar opposites, there was no middle ground. You were for the death penalty or you were against it. You were for 3 strikes and you're out, you were against it. And it was hard for us as a nation, I think, to sort of think rationally, frankly, about these issues. And in this atmosphere, the conservative end of the spectrum was basically always winning. So it became even more dug in over time. The reentry movement, I think after 10 years now we can call it a reentry movement, stands in sharp contrast to that highly polarized, highly ideological approach to crime policy. And we've seen in the Second Chance Act a bipartisan piece of legislation passed virtually unanimously in both houses. And you ask yourself, why did that happen? And there are 2 reasons I like to give. One is the reentry framework has always been very pragmatic. The title of the book, But They All Come Back, starts with the premise, we put them in there for a variety of reasons, but they're all coming home. What are we going to do? Right. So it's pragmatic. So
it's the iron law of prison.
Right, the iron law of incarceration. You got it. So there's not much room for ideological discussion if you start with that pragmatic assertion. But the politics of it are also interesting. And we developed a very important alliance between those on the progressive/liberal end of the spectrum and those on the conservative and Republican end of the political spectrum. And key to that alliance was the role of the evangelical right. The Prison Fellowship, founded by Chuck Colson, who did time in prison.
Something good came out of Watergate.
He did time in prison following his conviction for Watergate-related offenses. Prison Fellowship, now headed by Mark Earley, a former Attorney General of Virginia, when Attorney General, a very conservative guy on crime policy. And our liaison at the time was a fellow named Pat Nolan, a conservative Republican legislator from California who did time in federal prison for various federal offenses. So there was this fascinating alliance with the evangelical right. What they brought, besides their political capital, was they brought to the discussion a language from their religious faith that was very powerful. And it was a language of redemption, the notion that you condemn the sin but not the sinner, the sense that everybody has within himself an opportunity for seeing the light, and that our job as a society, whether in the private or public sector, is to help people find their way towards a better day. So that language and that political support was absolutely essential to the success of the movement.
Okay, let's go to some of the specific pieces of writing and argument and analyses that you've done. You testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the title of the testimony is New Strategies for Combating Violent Crime, Drawing Lessons from Recent Experience. And you talk about, first of all, this dramatic rise and then fall of crime. Why the decline?
You can't answer the question why the decline without answering the question or asking the question why the increase, because they're related.
Okay.
So we had In the early 1980s in New York, we were experiencing a good time. Crime was coming down. I was working in the police department at the time.
Deputy Commissioner?
No, this was special counsel.
Okay.
Special counsel to.
Oh, this is the 80s. I'm sorry.
To Commissioner Ward, first African American commissioner in New York, and everything was looking good. And he came back from a trip to Los Angeles. I remember this vividly. And he said that he'd seen something in Los Angeles called ice, or we called it then crack. And he said, when this hits New York, all bets are off. Crack hit New York, hit every urban center in America, and all bets were off. Mm-hmm. And we started a 7-year rapid increase in violence. It was a scary time. Yep. And crack destabilized communities, destabilized existing drug markets, brought in new people into the drug selling business, brought young people in there, and with them brought guns and settling adolescent disputes with firepower. It was a scary time. In the early 90s, we started to get control of that. It was, in essence, an epidemic, mm-hmm. like a health epidemic. And so we saw in New York in 92 and around the country, 92, 93, 94, the peak and then the very steady decline. So you have to give a lot of credit to the police of America, police in New York and elsewhere, for bringing crime rates down and for focusing in on those problematic locations and people and stabilizing some of those sort of volatile relationships. You also have to recognize that we had a significant increase in incarceration over mm-hmm. the same period of time. You also have to recognize that in the 90s we had a very strong economy that for the first time really reached down into the population in urban America that's highly at risk and both of committing crime and of being unemployed. We had some sensible gun control policies were enacted. So the best academic understanding of why crime came down is that it's a mix of these things. Mm-hmm. Certainly not the police alone, and it's not New York City alone. Mm-hmm. This was a national phenomenon. New York had a steeper decline than other cities. But these other factors, a strong economy, incarceration rates, some demographic changes contributed. But you have to ask what's happened since then, and basically what's the FBI data will support the idea that since the 2000 or so, it's been flat. The rates of violent mm-hmm. crime across the country have been flat. But we've seen this divergence at the local level. So some cities are showing declines and some cities increases.
Yeah, one of your warnings here in your testimony is to go beyond the national data and look at, first of all, international comparisons, then look at subnational or state comparisons, and then most particularly looking at the inner city and looking at what's happening there. Let's talk about those perspectives, particularly the inner city perspective, which is the one that you are obviously most concerned with.
Right. I think there's a tendency to be lulled into complacency by our good news. Our good news is that rates of violent crime are lower than they've been in a generation. And if you were to go to Europe, you'd find that our rates of violence are much higher than European cities, although we have lower rates of property crime than European cities. But at the city level, we're finding some very puzzling and disturbing trends where some cities are experiencing sharp increases in violence, and some cities like New York and Dallas and other cities around the country are experiencing declines. We don't know why that's happening. This is another pitch for more research.
Right.
But when you get down to the community level, the touchstone for every conversation mm-hmm. that we have on crime, incarceration, race has to be at the community level. At the community level, you find these very high rates of violence that we can only call unacceptable in democratic America. And I cite in my testimony an analysis done by my colleague John Clofus in Rochester, who points out that these national data are basically meaningless. We have to look at city level, we have to look at below city level, and we have to look at the populations at risk of killing and being killed. Mm-hmm. And those are in an age group that's basically 18 to 24 or so. Those are among men, much more so than women, and they're among African American men. So he did this analysis that looked at the homicide risk for young African American men in the high crime neighborhoods of Rochester. And he found that the risk of being killed among that subgroup was 65 times higher than the national average.
Wow.
That, to me, is the only reasonable way to talk about crime in America, is what is crime like when crime is at its worst? And it's at its worst in those neighborhoods and experienced by those young people. And that's where I think we have to focus our attention and not be lulled into complacency by the national numbers.
What do you do in terms of these very localized phenomena? What can the police do? What can the criminal justice system do? What can the larger society do? The first
thing you have to do is you have to understand it. You have to understand it empirically. Again, this is an area where there are lots of theories and lots of sort of hypotheses as to what's going on. I always like to start with the numbers. So my colleague David Kennedy, who's a professor at John Jay College, and a number of people who do similar work around the country, including Professor Klofus, do an analysis where they look at homicides in a particular city to determine who's at risk of being killed and of killing, and try to figure out how many people are actually engaged in the violent behavior. Mm-hmm. It's so obvious. If you were a doctor, you'd start by looking at the patients, right?
Right.
So we want to start by looking at who's at risk of killing or being killed, and inevitably you'll find, as Kennedy and others have found around the country, that it's a very small number of people engaged in very risky behaviors, mm-hmm. often associated with gangs or other types of group activity. And that's where the focus of our energy has to be, to talk to those young people, it's mostly young men, to figure out the relationships, and there's a lot of respect issues, there's a lot of sort of retaliation and between gangs and between groups, and it's not all about, we think it's drug markets, sometimes it is, but it's often about these other issues. And you have to get inside that culture, and you have to figure out what's going on and what's driving it.
There are interventions that have been proven to be successful, but they haven't been universally adopted. What are the interventions, and why the reluctance or the hesitancy or the inability to introduce them?
Well, this is where I think we have reason to be very optimistic about the future. I mentioned Professor Kennedy before. I've supported his work when I was at NIJ. I've been affiliated with him as a colleague for a number of years, and the work that he's doing both on gang violence, which is what we're talking about now, but also on drug markets, is for me the most exciting work going on around the country. And as I said, there are a number of colleagues now who are experimenting with these ideas. The core principles of this idea are that, first of all, you do the analysis that I just mentioned. Right. You figure out who's engaged in the activity. Secondly, you do something that we don't do enough, or maybe at all, which is you figure out a way to talk to the people who are engaged in the antisocial behavior.
This is this Operation Ceasefire that produced the Boston Miracle.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And you realize that sometimes the most influential person in the life of a young person is not the police, but it's their mother.
Right.
Right? We all know
Come
that,
on.
right? Right.
Let's be serious about this.
So these are not blinding sort of sociological insights. These are things that we know. And the role of what's different here and what takes work is that the role of the law enforcement and criminal justice agencies is, in a fundamental way, very different from traditional practice. So what the police do is they start to analyze the relationships between these groups and individuals. They develop a lot of street intelligence from their own cops and street workers about them. They then start to, in essence, make cases against them. We could arrest you on this charge, we could violate your parole, we could yank you on probation. And then they call those young people and their mothers and other influentials into a room.
Now, these other influentials are whom?
Mothers, pastors, uncles, wives, girlfriends.
You're talking about everybody is a potential stakeholder.
Somebody
in this
who has an interest in the well-being of that young person.
Go ahead.
And then with the help of the mayor or county executive, they bring social service providers into the same room. And the law enforcement officials basically say to those young people, we know who you are, we know what you're doing. In most cases, we could arrest you today, but we're not going to. That's different. That's a radical departure from the way cops and prosecutors are trained to think of their jobs. Right. We're not going to because we want you to get out of that life. What we're telling you is if the first body that falls, first guy that gets shot, or the first reemergence of this drug market, all bets are off.
Bust everybody.
And we're coming after you. And it's everybody. So you take the group dynamic that has this antisocial power, and you turn it around and you make it a pro-social power by saying all of you have to count on each other not to cross the line and get back involved in that activity.
Go ahead.
And when you do this, the results are phenomenal. But the important thing is not just a law enforcement voice, it's the voice of the community. And then you say to these same young people, and here's a way out. You have a priority to get social services, drug treatment, GED. We're making that available to you, and they're here to talk to you.
Are you sanguine that this approach can and will be adopted by other jurisdictions? Is that happening?
We convened at John Jay in January a very exciting meeting of 24 people around the country who are implementing or writing about these approaches. We had 3 police chiefs, 3 prosecutors in the room. We had people from academia, street workers, pastors, 24 of us, all doing this work over the past several years. And we asked the question, can we now take this to scale? And if we did take this to scale and presented this to the new administration and to Congress, how would we bring together the cities that are now doing this work? After that meeting, we counted the number of cities that are now doing either the gang violence work or the drug market work around the country, and there's 75 of them.
Okay.
It was shocking to us.
Okay. This is part 1. You're back next week. We'll talk about part 2.
Let's do it.
We're going. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.